Improper exercise can either create a diastasis recti or make a diastasis recti larger. A diastasis recti is the separation of your outermost abdominal muscles. These muscles are called the rectus abdominis, and they are joined together by a fibrous piece of connective tissue called the linea alba, which means white line. It runs right down here. And right smack in the middle of that piece of connective tissue is your belly button, and that belly button is a weak spot in the connective tissue. Everyone is born with their muscles separated, and usually at about 3 years old, after the nervous system has developed, the muscles will come together. Now, I don't say close because of that weak spot in the belly button. If you put a forward stretching movement or a sideward stretching movement on this connective tissue right around the belly button area, it is going to separate the muscles. So why do you care if the muscles are separated? 2 reasons. The first reason is that in order for the recti muscle to do its job, it has to be together. And its job is supporting your back and supporting your organs. When the muscles separate and the connective tissue stretches sideways, it is now the weak connective tissue ineffectively supporting your back, causing back problems, and ineffectively supporting your organs, causing them to move forward, causing the mummy tummy, the guy gut, bloating after you eat, reflux, constipation, and also it can put a pregnant woman at risk for a C-section because when the organs move forward during pregnancy, the uterus can move forward. So now, if it's forward, the cervix is going to be pointing sideways instead of downwards. So that's the first reason that you care. The second is that in order for the abdominal muscles to do the exercises correctly, they have to be together. If they're separated, when you do the abdominal exercises, they're going to move sideways. And a sideways movement does not strengthen the muscles. A sideways movement stretches the connective tissue. So the muscles need to be together in order for them to work front to back, which strengthens the muscles. So as long as I'm talking about the muscles, let me give you a little bit of a review. There's 3 layers of muscles. The outermost muscle, which is the rectus abdominis, which I just talked to you about. The middle layer are the obliques. They come on a diagonal, and they have you do this action, this forward crossover movement. And then the innermost muscle, which is the transverse abdominal muscle. Sometimes people call that the core. And this muscle wraps around your whole body like a corset, and it attaches on each side of your spine, and it goes from the bottom 6 ribs to the top of the pelvis and then comes around. And if you cut the muscle in half, the top would go behind the recti and the bottom would come in front. Now, the action of the transverse muscle is forwards and backwards. And the transverse is connected to the recti muscle. They're all the muscles are connected at the connective tissue. So when I move the transverse muscle forwards and backwards, I'm going to be bringing the recti back with it. And also there'll be some movement of the obliques, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So if the action is forwards and backwards, you use the transverse muscle with this forwards and backwards movement with every breath you take and with every move you make. So it's so important with your activities of daily living, and especially when you're exercising, in having transverse awareness and transverse strength. For example, if I go from a seated position to a standing position and I don't bring my transverse back towards my spine and hold it there, I'm going to be using it anyway. And there's going to be the force of my whole body weight stretching that connective tissue forward in that forward movement. So it's very important to have transverse strength and transverse awareness. I'm now going to talk about positioning of your body when you're exercising. So the first thing is that the easiest position to engage the transverse is in a seated position or a standing position. When you go into a hands and knees position with your abdominal facing down, that's going to be stretching your connective tissue because all the weight of your organs are going to be stretching that connective tissue in that forward movement, and it's very difficult to engage the transverse in that position. So if you have a diastasis, you're not going to be doing any abdominal facing down exercises. The other position, back lying, that I'd like to talk about is it's also very difficult to engage the transverse muscle in a back lying position. That's why I always recommend doing a little warm-up in a back lying position using your transverse before you do any back lying position. Now, I want to be really clear with this. In a back lying position, if the shoulders are off the floor, it's physically impossible to engage the transverse. And if it's physically impossible to engage the transverse muscle when the shoulders come off the floor, it's going to be going forward, stretching the connective tissue and making the muscles longer. And when we strengthen muscles, we want to make them shorter. They go front to back. So crunches can create a diastasis or make a diastasis larger. So you should never, ever, ever do crunches. The other thing that you should never do in a back lying position is this exercise crossover, because that's a double whammy. Not only are the shoulders going off the floor, giving you that forward stretch on the connective tissue, but it's this sideways movement which stretches it sideways, because when we do this movement, this is what happens, because remember, all the muscles are connected. So you get a sideward stretch and a forward stretch if you do this in a back lying position to work obliques. There's always other exercises to work the oblique muscles, and that is not one that you should do. Lastly, I would like to say that it's very important when you're working out to remember to hold your transverse in. If you can't hold your transverse in with whatever you're doing, and you can always test it to see, it means one of two things. Number one, that your transverse isn't strong enough and you need to do more of my seated transverse exercises, or you're in a position where it's physically impossible to engage the transverse, and that's in a back lying position with your shoulders off the floor. So you never want to do the crunches, the Pilates 100s, the roll-ups, the rollbacks, because it's physically impossible to engage the transverse. So I'm hoping that this is helpful in your workout to understand how, if you exercise improperly, that you can create a diastasis, and I'm hoping that you will now have a diastasis safe workout. Thank you.